Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, Numerics with Nadia. In today's video, we're going to do a lesson on different types of lines. If you haven't watched the previous two videos in the beginner geometry playlist, I would highly recommend watching those two first. We went over the properties of quadrilaterals, and we also classified two-dimensional shapes. So I would watch those two first prior to this video. In this video, we're going to split our lesson up into two parts. For part one, we are going to define and learn the differences between a ray, a line, and a line segment. And then for part two of our lesson today, we're going to define and go through the differences between a horizontal line versus a vertical line versus parallel lines versus perpendicular lines, and finally, intersecting lines. So our first part of the lesson, we have three terms that we're going to define, and in our second part of the lesson, we have 5 words that we're going to define. So the things that I would write in our notebooks right now for part 1 would be ray, line, line segment. And then for part 2, we have horizontal line, vertical line, parallel lines, perpendicular lines, and intersecting lines. So get a fresh sheet in your notebook ready. We're going to start with part 1. In part 1, we're going to draw a little chart out. In this chart, we're going to write our term, we're going to define it, and then we're also going to draw out the symbol and any type of associated notation that we have for these terms. So for our first term, we have a line. The definition of a line is a straight path that extends infinitely in both directions. So how will this look like? Well, it'll be a straight line with arrows on both ends to distinguish and show that it continues infinitely in both directions, right? So that is our first term. Our second term that we're going to define is a line segment. The definition of a line segment is part of a line with 2 endpoints. For the 2 endpoints, we're going to have our beginning point where we start and then our end point where we end. So we'll have 2 points with a line in between. Try to visualize that before I draw it out. And the symbol and how this would look like visually is we would have our 2 endpoints, right? Notice the difference here compared to the line. We have 2 endpoints with a line in between. No arrows for this one. The next term we're going to define is a ray. And a ray's definition is, again, it's part of a line with 1 endpoint and it continues forever in the other direction. So we already know from a line segment what an endpoint looks like, and we know what happens when something continues forever, right? So a ray is kind of a mixture of a line and a line segment. As you see here, we have 1 endpoint, a line, and then an arrow to show that it continues forever in that direction. Now, each one of these lines and line segments, they would be defined by 2 letters. So let's say that these are all going to be named AB. How we would show and notate a line labeled AB would be AB with a line on top with our arrows. How we would show and define a line segment with AB would be the letters AB with just a line over top. And for a ray, it would be the letters AB with an arrow one-sided above it. So now that we've defined all 3 terms for part 1 of our lesson, let's get into a little practice section for part 1. The directions for our practice section say, draw the following given the notations. So in this case, we're going to be given the notation and we're going to have to draw it out accordingly. So for number 1, it says CD and it has a line with 2 arrows above it. Number 2 is BC and it has a line with 1 arrow on one side. And number 3 is FG and it has just a line above it. So number 1 we know is a line. Now that we know it's a line, we can draw it out. It would have 2 arrows and then we would have points labeled CD. Number 2 is a ray. We would have an endpoint labeled B and then C, and it would have an arrow on one side. And number 3 would be a line segment. We would have a beginning point and an end point. The beginning point would be F and the end point being G. So now that we've gone through part 1, we defined all of our terms and we did a little practice section. Now we'll get into part 2. Again, we're going to write out our term, the definition, and a visual. This is a really good way to study because not only do we want the definition, but we also want to be able to recognize it visually. So having it side by side can be very helpful. The first term that we have for part 2 is a horizontal line. Now, the definition of a horizontal line is a straight line that moves from left to right. So try to visualize this before I draw it out. It is a straight line and it moves from left to right. So the way that this would look visually, we will draw it out here. It is a line, right? A line has an arrow on both ends and it is moving horizontally. Now, the opposite of a horizontal line would be a vertical line. Our next term, a vertical line, can be defined as a straight line that goes from up to down. So it moves up and down, the opposite of horizontal, which moves left to right. So this one would be a line as well, arrows on both ends, but it moves up and down. The next term we have is parallel lines. We have already defined this in a previous video. I will tag it right here for you guys. I would definitely recommend watching that video as well. Parallel lines are a pair of lines that will never cross, okay? They will never cross. They are parallel. So we will have two lines. It doesn't matter if they are vertical or horizontal. What matters is that they are side by side, they are parallel, and those little arrows that I drew on there, that is the notation for parallel lines. Now, the opposite of a parallel line would be a perpendicular line. The definition of a perpendicular line is, again, a pair of lines, so we have two lines, but these lines, they cross specifically at a right angle. So as you can see in the diagram on the right, we have those two lines. They're crossing right in the middle, which forms a 90-degree angle, which is a right angle. Again, that was in our previous video. I would highly recommend watching that one. But that representation is what perpendicular lines would look like. And our last term for today's lesson is intersecting lines. So these lines are a pair of lines that cross, okay? So like perpendicular lines, they will cross, but they do not form a right angle. So these can look any type of way, whereas perpendicular lines need to cross at a specific angle. But intersecting lines, right, as you can see, a line, two arrows on both ends, and they are intersecting. So I'm going to zoom out here. I want you guys to copy this down in your notebook. Make sure you have the previous 3 terms from part 1 as well, and we will get into our last practice section for today's lesson. For our last few practice problems, our directions say to classify the following diagrams by name. So we will be given the visual and we will need to label it accordingly. For number 1 here, let's look at our visual. This looks like a vertical line to me, right? It has arrows and it moves up and down. So number 1 would be a vertical line. Number two, let's see what our drawing looks like. This one has arrows on both sides and there are 2 sets of them. So these would be parallel lines, right? 2 lines, they will not intersect and they both continue on forever. So number 2 would be parallel lines. Number 3 here, we have 2 lines with arrows on the end, but they are crossing. So that would be a definition of an intersecting line, right? They are just crossing, they're not forming any particular angle. So number 3 would be intersecting lines. Number 4, we have a horizontal line, okay, with a vertical line going through it, and it's forming 90-degree angles. So the name of this would be perpendicular lines, right? So number 4 would be a perpendicular line. And our last practice problem for today, let's see what the visual looks like. For number 5, we have a line that moves from left to right with arrows on both ends. So this one would simply be a horizontal line. So number 5 would be a horizontal line. All right, you guys, great work today. I know that we went through 8 different vocab words, so definitely keep those terms in your notebook. Make sure you keep adding to this as we continue on with our lessons. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please feel free to like it if you did, comment any questions you have or any other videos you would like to see, share this video with a friend, subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you guys next time.